Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this beautiful morning. It's been rainy these last couple days. It's a bit brisk where I am, and if you can hear those birds, and we've had mourning doves out and just birds flying everywhere. I love these mornings. They don't always happen like this, and it's nice just to have a pause. It's interesting because today, jumping into Job chapter 28, chapter 28 is a pause. I think it's important anytime you read any book, it's been organized, collected, organized, arranged, and then presented. And it's not really much different in the Bible. There have been an assortment of literature that have been collected. That literature has been organized and arranged and then presented from thousands and thousands of years. And how that came about. It's a whole nother conversation. But specifically with Joe, we did talk about this. There's an easy breakdown that's recognizable as you read the book. There's a prologue at the beginning. We've read those two chapters at the beginning. And then there are a series of speeches and discourses, and they're clearly uh, represented. In Job replies, Bildad's response, and you can see that it's number one or two or three in the procession to each other. We come to chapter 28, and it's interesting. We close on Job kind of turning the pressure back to his friends. His friends have kind of shown to be enemies, and so he reminds them of their wickedness, or he reminds the lesson of wickedness is still applicable to them. And it's a warning and rebuke to his friends to back off and that they have crossed lines. So Job, in that last chapter that we read in 27, he cries out again. That his integrity requires and demands that he has to give a response to his friends, and that the response that he's giving is in defense of his innocence, that he needs to stand before God, and then he gives a discourse reminding them that he understands the lessons of wickedness, but its implication is that his friends should consider the same. Interesting enough. Chapter 28 is a pause. It's the author, and regardless of ownership, some scholars attribute this as potentially Moses writing it. Others suggest it was Job. Some suggest that the same Jobab is the same gentleman who is Esau's son. There's some potential inference there. We don't know for absolute certain. Regardless of that, within the context, you can clearly see that there's a pause here and there's a narration, as if the narrator comes in and is telling the story. And so the story's been drawn out, the prologue happened. One of my favorite movies is The Princess Bride. The grandfather's in there, and he's the one narrating the story for his grandson. And there's these moments where they pause in between and they're back together having their conversation. And or as if the author is taking a minute to pause everything. You've heard it up to this point. I want to interject here for a second, and then there's an anticipation of a response based on chapter 28. So chapter 28 serves as a narration of the story. The author comes in and he interjects for a second about wisdom, and then that after you read that, you have this anticipation and assumption that it's going to be responded to and answered in the following portion. And the next portion to follow is the monologues. These monologues have a little bit of a different focus, a little bit of a different weight to them, and I think we'll see that as we read through them. And you hear each one present a little bit differently than the speech and discourse. So there's a long monologue to follow here. Next time we have our next video. Chapter 29, 30, and 31 are all Job talking about his former life. You get this monologue is a beautiful monologue. You get to see inside his mind and his soul for just a minute as he shares, his former life, his current anguish, and then protesting his innocence. And then there's a long, long monologue by a guy named Elihu, who we'll have some conversations about. And then God will have, we'll spend some time speaking on behalf of Job. So I want to share, in light of all of that, you realize again that this information, this data, this text was collected, organized, arranged, and presented. Similar, Proverbs, we talked another time about, in another series, I talked about Proverbs as wisdom literature, all of those little couplets, and it was collected, organized, arranged, and presented to God's people with a purpose. Job is not too dissimilar from that. There are different emphasis, but it's still, there is a recognizable breakdown. And so we're going to pause today and stop with that consideration that the author, or in this case, we'll just simply say narrator, has come in. It could be Job after the fact. It could be another author. Regardless, this is an interjection. We want to pause. It's intended to have its own emphasis, as it kind of is like the intermission in a play or a movie or something where it stops. It gives a summation of some things. It asks us a new question to pause and recognize the source of wisdom. And then we should anticipate an answer and a response in the following chapters. So that's its purpose. That's the intent. That's why we have to kind of give it its own emphasis. And why we mentioned last time why we needed to give it its own section, because that's the way it's presented, and that's the way it's written and presented. So we want to honor that and pause and let it have its intended effect. So today, let's allow this to have its intended effect on us as we read Job chapter 28. So, people know where to mine silver. They know how to refine gold. They know where to dig iron from the earth and how to smelt copper from rock. They know how to shine light in the darkness and explore the farthest regions of the earth as they search in the dark for ore. They sink a mine shaft into the earth far from where anyone lives. They descend on ropes, swimming back and forth. Food is grown on the earth above, but down below the earth is melted as by fire. Here the rocks contain precious lapis lazuli, and the dust contains gold. These are treasures no bird of prey can see, no falcon's eye can observe it. No wild animal has walked upon these treasures, no lion has ever set his paw there. People know how to tear apart flinty rocks and overturn the roots of mountains. They cut tunnels in rocks and uncover precious stones. They dam up the trickling streams and bring to light the hidden treasures. But do people know where to find wisdom? Do you see what he set up? People know all sorts of interesting things, difficult things, hard things. And then he begs the question of, but do we know where to find wisdom? I think you can clearly see how the author and the narrator here is intentionally causing a pause and asking us to think some things. Where do we find wisdom? Where can those individuals find understanding? No one knows where to find it, for it is not found among the living. It is not here, says the ocean, nor is it here, says the sea. It cannot be bought, says the gold. It cannot be purchased, says silver. It is worth more than all the gold of Ophir, greater than the precious onyx or lapis lazuli. Wisdom is more valuable than gold and crystal. It cannot be purchased with jewels mounted in fine gold. Coral and jasper are worthless in trying to get it. The price of wisdom is far above rubies. Precious peridot from Ethiopia or Cush, some translations say, cannot be exchanged for it. It's worth more than the purest of gold. But do people know where to find wisdom? Where can they find understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all humanity. Even the sharp-eyed birds in the sky cannot discover it. Destruction and death say, we've heard only rumors of where this wisdom can be found. God alone understands the way of wisdom. He knows where it can be found. for he looks throughout the whole earth and sees everything under the heavens. He decided how hard the winds should blow, how much rain should fall. He made laws for the rain and laid out a path for the lightning. Then he saw wisdom and evaluated it. He set it in place and examined it thoroughly. And this is what he says to all humanity: the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. To forsake evil is real understanding. So we have this interjection, and we're supposed to have this now as the new umbrella that we read everything else through. That through this lens, we're going to filter what's being said in the coming chapters through this new perspective that is given to us. As it says this, that what God says to all of humanity, there's no exclusion there, all of humanity, the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. To forsake evil is true, real understanding. We mentioned towards the beginning of our video in James chapter 1, and in a similar fashion, James says, considering it pure joy, my brothers, when you are faced with trials of many kinds, for you know that this testing of our faith produces endurance and produces, a lasting faith. And then he goes into a little invitation that we who lack wisdom can ask God, who is gracious and giving and will gladly, generously supply. And again, reminding us that God is the source. And it echoes Job. It echoes saying that the fear of the Lord is true wisdom, forsaking evil is true understanding. What is the author saying to us in this passage? We need to stop and pause and think about this as you're reading through it, and as if you've listened today. We find that we're capable of doing all sorts of stuff. We can fly planes across oceans. We can develop vaccines. We can see the smallest things in microscopes. We can see to the far reaches of space with new technology and satellites. We are able to pick up a device that we can call somebody across the world and have a second delay in response, that my word can echo here in a few seconds, can echo over in China or other countries. I talked to my brother a few times over in other parts of the world, and he's on the other side of the earth from me, and it's amazing how quickly I can speak with him. I look at this and I think, the author is helping us realize that in all of our efforts, they're futile. You cannot find wisdom in any of those things. True wisdom, you can find cheap imitations. You can find counterfeit. There's this reference here, this idea, it's far greater than the price and value of rupees. It's in comparison. I was out in Colorado not too long ago, and my kids, they came across some fool's gold in some stores, and we had some individuals telling us about the counterfeit gold, and they were talking about imitation and substitute, and these cheap substitutes, these cheap imitations. They're not, when you push them through the same standards of refining like gold does, they fail, and they do not produce the same quality product. If you take that mindset and you think about this, that when it's pushed to the same standards, it's not able to produce the same refined product. Are you hearing what I'm saying this morning? It is speaking deeply to my heart that what God is doing here and helping us understand that there is a refining process that God is doing that produces the proper refined product. And if it's a cheap imitation of that, it will produce something else that has far less worth. Whatever you are going through, I think there's a song by Hawk Nelson, I think it is. He's Making Diamonds. It's kind of a fun song because it kind of has to do. It's reflective of this message today. I think it's Hawk Nelson. You can look that up. Find Diamonds, I think, is the name of the song. He's making diamonds out of us. He's making diamonds out of dust. It's the idea that whatever we're going through, the weight and the pressure is producing something of value. That you can realize that there's some meaning behind it. There's some value behind and validity behind what you're going through that you do not see yet. And that as you've gone through it, if it's directing you toward God, then you are gaining a true valuable treasure. That the treasure of wisdom and understanding far outweigh all the gold in the world, all the rubies. That is what's being communicated. And I hope that we can clearly receive that message today, that, and this is what God says to all of humanity. This is what it says here, God saw wisdom, he evaluated it, he set it in place, and he examined it thoroughly. And this is what he says to all humanity. The final response on that is the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. What else should we be afraid? And this word fear here can mean a lot of things. It can mean awe, which is awful or fearful or terror, overwhelming. It can mean all of those things. This idea of honor, respect, of his authority. It recognizes, that sheer awesomeness of who God is. So this word fear there can be applied in a number of different ways, but it should ultimately conclude that God is amazingly awesome and beyond our understanding or thinking. That should cause us pause. It should cause us to realize that all the things that are said about him that are true should affect us mentally and spiritually in a lot of different ways. So pause on that note for a second. And then as he concludes that the fear of the Lord is true wisdom, honoring, recognizing God is all powerful. When my kids, at nighttime, I am not all powerful. Hopefully I'm not drawing you to that conclusion. Far from it. Sitting on a couch, wrapped up in a blanket, snuggling in close to me, holding me tight, and sniffing my shirt, smelling just that sense of safety and security, that I'm in a safe place. This person loves me. This person is stronger than I am. This person can protect me in the moment. We can look at God like that. He is our Father. Jesus teaches us this later on, how to pray, how to talk to him, how to realize who God is. And he says, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. We have seen how Jesus, in humility, walked the earth and was the suffering servant on our behalf. And we've talked about that. And in wisdom, we pause here for just a minute and realize the fear of the Lord is true wisdom. You should feel safe and secure. It's not that kind of fear and terror that overtakes us unless we are at the brunt of his rebuke or his chastisement, which brings us to a different perspective. But then ultimately, it leads us to this final response. The forsaking of evil is understanding. So when we understand the nature of wisdom and its intent, its purpose is to help us forsake evil. God detests evil. Have you had frustrations over the evil in the world around you? The injustices, the darkness, the unmerciful, the uncompassionate, the murderous, the slanderous, the people who just cause problems. And forsaking that there is an evil. And God is saying understanding is to forsake evil. It's to fear the Lord, to recognize truism, and forsaking evil is true understanding. I wish that our whole entire world could be more understanding. As you look at the world around you, you realize there is a lack of understanding, especially when it comes to injustice and evil being suffered or evil prospering and wicked people prospering, and righteous people, well-intended, good-natured people suffering, seemingly without cause, or without purpose, or without value. So reading through this chapter, we pause today, and we stop, and we shift lenses, we shift focus. In the rest of the remaining book, we had the prologue, we heard Job, he's going through his pain and suffering, and the arguments that take place, and we've got to watch a scene unfold before us as if it were a play, and they played it all out. And we watch these characters go back and forth, and the suffering, and knowing some behind the scenes, like, oh, I just wish these people could come to an understanding with each other. And there's so much suffering and so much pain and hurt and agony. And then there's this challenge back at Job saying, you be reminded of wickedness yourselves. And then there's a pause. Intermission. And we talk about wisdom, and the narrator interjects for a second. And then we shift back to camera number 2. And we take a new story, a little bit of a new perspective as it takes a new turn into the future. Our next video, we're going to talk about chapters, let's see here, 29, 30, and 31. Job is going to burst out in a monologue. Former blessing, his former life, he's going to stop and meditate on that for a second. And then he's going to go into his anguish in his present state. And then he's going to, again, protest his innocence. That's the way it's been presented. And so we'd like to pause this morning and then just pray on that note in Job chapter 28. We're halfway through, and this is the intermission, where we pause and we reflect on the nature of wisdom, the origin of wisdom, the source of women, oh dear Jesus, the source of wisdom, and an understanding. Wisdom being the fear of the Lord, and true understanding is the turning away from evil. Forsaking is the word that is used there. Forsaking. Let's pray. God, I thank you for this beautiful morning, this quiet reprieve. There's no breeze. It's just a little chilly, but it's gentle, it's quiet, it's peaceful. It's a great pause. It's a great day to pause and filter all of what we're going through the lens of your wisdom and understanding. That, God, you have purposes, you have intentions, you have plans for us, and you can be trusted. God, that we can cozy up on your lap and trust in, and that you've got us in your hand and it is under control, and we are safe with you, and that you have a plan and a purpose for everything. God, I thank you for this this literature that we've been reading through, that it would be an encouragement as we stop in our life and we stop and we realize the things that are of value, the things that are of importance, that they're rightly weighted, that they're rightly on scales, and there's just weights, God, determining their values. That fool's gold, when it's refined in the same process as gold, does not become the same product. God, if we will be submissive to your plans and your purposes and your processes, God, that we will become the product that you are developing us into, which we understand to be the image of Christ. And that is the intention. Help us to become that. God, oh, by all your grace, God, help us to become like Jesus, we pray. In your name, amen. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.